Good morning, good afternoon. This is Planet Retail RNG with our webinar on US retail. We will start in 30 seconds, just giving more people time to join. So let's kick off. Thanks very much for joining. Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to our webinar on the drivers of change in US retail, on future disruption in US retail, and in particular on what suppliers need to do in this changing environment to succeed. We appreciate your dialing in for this webinar. And just before we start, a few introductory remarks. Firstly, we would like this to be an interactive session. So as the webinar progresses, if you have any questions, please share them with us directly via the chat function, and we will answer them either right here in the webinar or we will get back to you shortly. A quick word on who we are as we turn over to the world map with our offices highlighted in it, and that's offices in London, in Boston, in Frankfurt, and in Mumbai. We are Planet Retail RNG. We are a global intelligence and advisory business exclusively focused on retail, and in particular on helping our customers prepare for future growth via education, insights, and sharing of best practice. Now, what we are looking at today is based on a report that we recently published on the RNG portal, looking at the future of retail and disruption and drivers of change in the US market. Presenting today are Osman Bar, research analyst from our office in Boston, and myself, director for go-to-market insights in Frankfurt. And once again, before we start, if you have got any questions, please feel free to share those via the chat function. So I can see the starting page of the report now. If you could turn over to the next slide. So that is the map with our 4 offices showing what a global business we are. And if we could move on down to the next slide now. This shows the framework of our research that we have approached our analysis of the US market with. Now, STEEP is the analytical framework that we here at Planet Retail RNG use to look at the drivers of change that are changing the world and shaping the future of retail, and that we believe both CPG suppliers and retailers must be aware of to succeed in a world that is changing fast. We look at drivers of change in society, in technology, in the economy, in the retail industry, and in the political framework, drivers that will change the world. And as the world changes, what changes with it is the way people live and the way people shop and the way retailers need to serve their customers, and ultimately the way CPG suppliers need to work with their retailer clients. Today, we are looking at the drivers of change in the US and what they mean for the industry. And with this, I hand over to my colleague Usman in Boston, who will start off with a broad view of today's topic.
Thanks, Boris. So before we delve into sort of the specific drivers of change that Boris talked about, we wanted to give a very high-level overview of the US landscape, citing a few sort of stats that we have here. The US accounts for almost 20% of global retail, and we expect the US to grow around 3.4% CAGR through 2022, which is higher than most developed markets. As we know, developing markets tend to go much more faster, but once you much more developed, it's harder to grow at a higher CAGR than that. And I wanted to highlight a few of the top US retailers. As we know, this list is no surprise, Walmart is sort of the top. But a call out here is that the majority of the top 5, with the exception of Amazon, are all store-based retailers. However, with the emergence of e-commerce and since digital represent most of the growth prospect, we're seeing a lot of these retailers reorienting themselves and focusing more on digital. Walmart is a clear example with the acquisition of Jet, and recently with online grocery, they partner with Postmate. So we're seeing a lot of work with these retailers sort of shifting towards online, redefining some of their stores to meet this changing digital landscape, which we would talk in detail in the upcoming slides. And so we've sort of highlighted a few of the really key trends that are affecting the US market right now. One is just middle class erosion. We're increasingly seeing sort of this polarized market where you have premium shoppers on one end and you have sort of shoppers that are very squeezed on the other end. And we would discuss what are some of the implications of that. How do you reorient your business to meet these divide? Digital transformation, of course, as we know, is one that's really changing the landscape within the US and what effects that is having on supply chain innovations. So with that, we would delve into some of the specific drivers of change, and I'll hand it over to Boris to start off with society.
Thanks very much, Osman. And starting off with aging, the US population, and this really is one of the most relevant drivers of change in a number of Western societies, not just in America, but the US population also is aging very fast, and the share of people aged 65 or older will double within just one generation, from 12% at the beginning of the century to over 20% by 2030, which isn't that far away. So a fifth of the population will be pensioners by then. And it goes without saying that this will have a significant impact on how people live, how they shop, how retailers cater for their new demands, and how suppliers need to support all this. Among the things that will change is a growing demand for convenience and service, as, for example, elderly people are less likely to drive, so this includes home delivery as a service, but it also extends to things like product curation, packaging, labeling, and the like that retailers and suppliers need to be aware of. Also, a result of the aging in society is the growing number of small households, which is changing shopping behaviors. For example, when I was a kid here in Germany, we're a family of 7, and that was not such a terribly rare thing at the time in the 1970s. But today, after birth rates have declined 40% in Europe and the US, most households, both in the US and in Europe, they feature hardly more than 2 people. And this is making the concept of a big weekly family shopping trip increasingly obsolete. So in other words, shopping behaviors are changing and are turning towards proximity and convenience-based formats that can serve the needs of a busy, independent, on-demand shopper. Another effect which aging is having in society is the need for more income redistribution, and that is putting pensions under pressure and putting pressure on taxpayers. So this is eroding the middle class, as Usman has mentioned, as a trend, and is contributing to a growing split in society, to a division in society between wealthy and the less wealthy or the poor. And we know retail is always a function or a mirror of social conditions in society. And we see this is having an effect already on where the retail landscape is going, and it is going to split into a low-cost, efficiency-based, no-frills replenishment part of the market, and on the other side, a more experiential, discovery-driven upper mid-market part of the segment. Now, for suppliers, serving both ends is of great importance, but obviously requiring different capabilities. In terms of experiential mindsets, another driver of change we are seeing in society is a shift, especially under younger consumers, but in fact stretching wide into the middle of the US. That's a shift towards experience, enjoying higher priority than consumption and social status, which is more of a 1980s thing looking at it today. And it's crucial for retailers and suppliers to understand the needs and the changing needs that consumers have. And I mean, what a deep emotional needs they have, such as caring for a family, caring for the environment, having a greater meaning in life, being part of a community. It is things like these that retailers and CPG need to be aware of so they can grow their relevance in the market or simply defend their relevance in the market. And finally, looking at the attention spans, we are seeing attention spans decline in the US. Again, not just in the US, but also in the US. And of course, this is hard to quantify as nobody even knows what attention is, scientifically speaking. But generally, the use of smartphones and the fast availability of products, services, entertainment has made people's willingness to wait quite small, and their willingness to focus on things for a longer period of time. And this has implications for how you merchandise products, as CPG and retailers need to engage customers, grab their attention, and keep them engaged, as they may only get a small number of chances to grab the attention of a consumer. With this, I hand over to Usman, who is going to look at trends and drivers of change in technology.
So switching over to sort of the drivers of change within the technology landscape, one of the first ones we've seen is just the ubiquity of devices that we have. Maybe 20 years ago, an average American household might have only a desktop and maybe a landline. Now we're seeing an household would have 4 or 5 different sort of devices that they have, ranging from mobile to iPad to PCs and desktop. And so what we're seeing with all of these is that it's creating different consumer touch points, and the high mobile penetration that we see also in the US and faster wireless network speeds are creating sort of on-demand consumer that Boris talked about, with access to unlimited information in their pocket and high expectations of convenience and personalization. Another effect that this is having is the explosion of consumer data from sort of pervasive connectivity, which is enabling brands and retailers to understand and target shoppers better than ever before. And if we move on to sort of the rise of e-wallet, currently credit cards are the mainstream form of payment, but we're seeing e-wallet and mobile payment sort of gaining ground and expected to grow even further, with many retailers really trialing all these different mobile adoptions. A few recent ones, Target, for example, rolled out mobile pay in store, mostly available to their Red Card loyalty members. But we've seen other major players over the years, including Aldi, US, JCPenney, and Kroger, which partnered with Chase to offer mobile payment in selected retail market. So these are just a few examples of retailers that are really trialing these different mobile payment options. And at the core of this, it's been enabled by the rise of e-commerce and omni-channel, which is sort of blending online and offline together. And we're seeing them also reducing friction and speeding up the store checkout process. Nowadays, if you walk into like a Walmart store, you can just use your phone, do the shopping, navigate the store, and you can just check out as you go along, which really reduces that friction and makes your experience much more different than what you would have before. And moving on, we also seen increasingly the role of artificial intelligence in stores. Many retailers and brands are now utilizing artificial intelligence to either optimize buying, sourcing, deliveries, replenishment, pricing, and promotions. And we're seeing as these technologies grow, what's happening is that it's improving, especially in the areas of machine learning. Retailers are able to react faster to their customers' demands. They're able to create in real time sort of demand. And if you combine that with sort of the readily availability of data that with the different devices that we have, we're seeing a wall or a scenario where retailers can manage their inventory on time, where they can really target customers on time across different platforms and different devices. And finally, within technology, is sort of automation and robotics. Robotics is a little bit, it's still in its early phase, but we're seeing tremendous use with automotive vehicles, where drones and robots, those still in the early phase, they're still being employed in warehouses for inventory management. Amazon, for instance, is a great example, using that, and especially in solving the last mile, which is often the most expensive part of the delivery process, is getting that goods within the last mile. And we've seen many retailers beginning to deploy drones and robot and other forms of automotive devices to be able to address those issues. And in the future, what we would see, as those gain scale, they would be able to reduce cost for retailers and brands. And so these are ones that CPG suppliers should be aware of, and maybe be early partners to be able to adopt some of these technologies, because that's going to have a huge impact on how you process these devices, but also how you do packaging. It would be different packaging for a truck compared to like a drone. So there has to be differences in that. And with that, I'll turn over to Boris, who talk about the economic landscape.
Thanks very much, Usman. So the first thing to say, and probably surprisingly to many, is the economy in the US is currently doing fairly well. And I think it's important to put this economic picture in perspective. Since the Trump administration came to power, the public debate, certainly internationally, on the US has been largely dominated by awareness on risks and around protectionism, public debt, and social division, and what a difficult guy he is. But and please do not get me wrong. Many of those risks need to be taken very seriously, and any business operating in the US must be aware of those. But at the time, it's worth highlighting that for now and currently, the US economy is actually doing well, generating jobs, growing quarter after quarter, and that's partly thanks to growth impulses that have come from the very Trump administration. And as the retail industry is changing fast, it's important for retailers and suppliers, I believe, to see this as an opportunity to invest in digital transformation. This is a good time to invest, and the next recession will certainly not be a better time for this than now. Looking at the trade wars, one of the long-term risks we've been hearing about, and in fact, all you need to do to hear about this, turn on the TV or look at any newspaper. One of the things we've been hearing about is the risk of trade wars, because they disrupt supply chains, discourage imports. In fact, they question the whole system of a global free trade environment, which much of the wealth of the Western world has been based on since the 1940s. And as such, trade wars are a disrupting factor and a driver of inflation, as imported products get substituted by more expensive domestically manufactured items. And as we've been seeing over the past couple of weeks, there's a very real risk of these protectionist moves to trigger retaliation, for example, on the side of China, on the side of Russia, which then in turn damages the export prospects of US businesses and therefore undermining job creation. So it's a very complex issue. It's tricky, and it's an issue that we certainly cannot fix tonight, but it's important for businesses with international supply chains, both retailers and CPG, to monitor developments and defend or build supply chains as disruption safe as possible. Then moving on to interest rates and energy prices, these are a couple of factors that always have the potential to disturb consumer sentiment in a society like the US. The first of them is the interest rates, because changes in interest rates will impact homeowners with flexible mortgages and therefore have very direct impact on discretionary incomes, which retail will feel. And the other is energy prices, which partly depend on political moves in oil exporting nations and geopolitical developments in the Middle East. At the moment, interest rates are low and energy prices are fairly low, which is good, which is great, fantastic for retail, as it backs up consumer spending. However, businesses need to be aware that this effect will pass at some point. So the trick for retailers and suppliers is to be prepared and feature a proposition that is relevant for consumers in good times and in bad times, and that essentially means recession-proof business models. The middle class erosion that Usman mentioned before is another major topic, and as mentioned previously, this is the economic side of social development, which sees societies aging and getting less wealthy and splitting into a low income and a high income part, with the middle getting thinner and thinner every year. For retailers and for suppliers, this means there's an urgent need to be clearly positioned in the marketplace and to take a clear message about customer benefits to shoppers in each part of the market. And not to be ignored, this includes a long-term demand for affordable quality products in the market. And this will be served by discounters and online and private label, but the whole efficient replenishment mission-serving part of the industry, that's going to look after the lower income part of the market. And playing in this space obviously demands very specific capabilities from CPG suppliers that are different from working with the likes of Whole Foods. And finally, the US features infrastructure deficits, which we think is interesting for retail, and because it mainly affects overland transport infrastructure. And so why does it matter for retail? I think it matters because this is the time when the shopper turns into an on-demand consumer, and retailers turn into on-demand enterprises to serve them, and that in turn will demand, that retail industry in turn will demand from suppliers that they turn into on-demand suppliers, offering great flexibility in logistics, not just in the last mile, but also in the very important first mile. So the challenge for CPG brands and retailers now is to enable a frictionless consumer experience in the face of a public infrastructure that has a long-term outlook of remaining underfunded even after the electoral campaign of Trump. So as retail logistics is becoming more important, infrastructure remains in a weak state. So be aware of that. And with this, I hand over to Osman for some comments on drivers of change in the industry.
All right. So within the industrial landscape, one of the first things we wanted to look at is just the shift within the US landscape. If you look at the chart on the right, you can see that e-commerce is increasingly gaining share within the US. And what's important about that, it's not just share that they're gaining, but it's the influence overall that they're having on shopping. So I could be in a store, but still comparing prices on Amazon.com, for instance, just before I make a purchase within the store. So it's not just shifting sales, but also influencing consumer behavior and the way we buy things, both in store and out of store. And what we've seen with this is that the big bucks, traditionally the big bucks, are under pressure. They're losing shares to smaller stores like convenience and discounters. Which is sort of the result of the middle class erosion and sort of digital disruptions that's happening. But these stores wouldn't necessarily go away. What would happen is that they've been redefined and their role have been changed. So we've seen Walmart, for instance, increasingly leveraging a physical asset as fulfillment centers, but also introducing buy online, pick up in store. So we would continue to see initiatives like that and like ways that big bucks can leverage their stores so that instead of shifting sales, it's been complementary. Offline and online become sort of two complementary sides to it. We must be aware that small bucks and online represent most of the growth in the US. And within online, 3P marketplaces by far sort of are the biggest online channel, and they dominate, of course, with Amazon leading in that space. You have eBay, and you have some of these other big traditional sort of store-based retailers are also now launching 3P marketplaces with Walmart, and with the recent news of Albertsons also launching its own 3P marketplaces. We believe there would be few sort of dominant players within this space. We also see sort of the rise of intermediaries who are increasingly influencing sort of where shoppers shop and also just redirecting. So someone might be on Facebook and see an ad for a product that could then redirect you into where you buy and how that decision is made. We've seen as the pressure of competition and the range of online shopping is sort of forcing established brick and mortar retailers to drive the expansion of online to offline models, which is sort of further accelerating this shift to digital retail. With that, I'll turn over to Boris.
And thanks very much, Osman. So here's a look at the political landscape and what's going to define the future of the market. So one, of course, is the tax cuts that are benefiting businesses and consumers. And it ties into the economic section that we have discussed previously, namely the fact that the economy is currently doing fairly well in the US. It has been growing for a number of consecutive quarters now. And one of the reasons behind this is economic stimulus. The tax cuts that are pushed through by President Trump will see the majority of US taxpayers walk away with more money in their pockets. And it is, however, not guaranteed that retailers will benefit most from this, as the trend towards buying experiences is powerful and must be seen as a competitive threat. So retailers will do well if they embrace this trend towards more experience, adding experiential elements to their stores, such as events, food service areas, digital elements, and the like. And CPG will do well if they support this transformation, as well as digital transformation in a broader sense, and offer themselves as relevant partners to retailers here. In terms of healthcare, the ongoing debate about healthcare and undergoing sort of around undoing much of the Obamacare work is something I would like to highlight as a risk, as there's a visible trend now towards shifting more of the health risk and associated health cost onto the shoulders of consumers. This will create pressure on the middle and lower income parts of the population, who are essential customer groups for most retailers and virtually all CPG brands. The long-term trend, and let me state this very clearly, is towards minimalist insurance catalogs and high out-of-pocket contributions for consumers. And by the way, this is not just the case in the US, but across developed markets. It's a typical phenomenon in aging societies. So it also affects Germany, the UK, France, but definitely also the US. But it's perhaps the US where this debate is currently most visible and most intense. So healthcare reform, threat to spending power of middle class and lower income parts of the population. The next political trend we are looking at is immigration restriction. And again, this is not an exclusive US policy feature, but it's also happening elsewhere, for example, in Brexit Britain. So there are risks on the consumer confidence side that may inspire immigrant populations to cut back on spending just to be safe, as everyone waits and sees what's going to happen to them and their residential status. The other is that risks of restricted permissions of residence will discourage immigrants from entering the country. You could now, of course, say this is exactly what the Trump administration is aspiring to achieve, but it creates a challenge for low-wage industries in terms of workforce. And low-wage industries include retail and manufacturing and food service and agriculture and warehousing and logistics. So it is obvious that retailers and their suppliers and their service providers are facing a decent level of insecurity here. One of the answers to this is likely to be automation in retail and automation in manufacturing and in logistics, all of which is creating opportunities for retail technology vendors. Now, looking at economic protectionism, the next point, I'm conscious of time actually, so let me say briefly that this is the political perspective on what we've discussed before, namely the either potential or factual disruption of international supply chains, combined with the risk that import restrictions will also drive inflation and therefore undermine the spending power of the US consumer. Retailers and suppliers need to monitor this, and to give this a political spin, I would even go as far as saying that retailers and suppliers have an interest in lobbying against economic protectionism. And finally, we thought it'd be great to mention data security as a topic, not just because Mark Zuckerberg famously was facing tough question by US politicians a couple of days ago, but very obviously because data protection is becoming a big topic in the US now. In fact, the number of data security breaches in the US has risen so fast in recent months, and we're hearing about retailers being affected by this almost all the time now. And this is damaging trust in digital transformation and trust in online transactions in particular. And as a result, retailers have a big interest not only in protecting their own data, but also in teaming up to protect the credibility of the industry as a whole. So let's turn to the next slide. And I hand over to Osman for this.
With this slide, as we come into the end, we wanted to wrap this this presentation with sort of 9 high-level sort of future scenarios. So say you look back 10, 15, 20 years from now, what is the summary? What are some of the high-level future scenarios that we see the US market looking at? So if we look at the first one, a fast aging population and a more polarized society, what we mean by that is by 2030, the US would see a larger share of population age 65 plus than those under 14. The US market is sort of increasingly split into a budget and a premium segment, which is reflecting social division and forcing clearer than ever decisions on which software to focus on. And if we're looking at sort of the ubiquity of data, the growth of big data combined with an exponential increase in computing power will enable businesses to provide highly targeted products and services. More than ever, customer retention is becoming more critical than acquisition. Retailers would have to keep all the shoppers more engaged and increase switching costs for building out ecosystems. We also seen increasingly loyalty programs would that reward experiences would be crucial to retaining customers, as we've as Boris mentioned, sort of the change from especially younger shoppers switching from buying physical things to buying experiences. Retailers would have to sort of integrate their loyalty programs to reward experiences as well. We're seeing the role of big box store. I think that would be redefined. It's already happening, and it would only continue to be accelerated. Hypermarket and superstores will not be as dominant and would be forced to reinvent their space to stay relevant, supporting new fulfillment solutions and providing experiences. In the future, AI and sort of future VR application could disrupt the way consumers interact with the store. Another trend we're seeing is sort of 3P marketplaces will dominate. The Amazon is already dominating in a lot of ways, and it's not unique to the US. In fact, China, the e-commerce is sort of the biggest market in the world, and really Alibaba and JD just really dominate that market, and we expect to see some of those trends going forward. 3P marketplaces would account for the majority of e-commerce sales added through 2022. Retail is becoming sort of ubiquitous, and that's enabled by digital payment methods, connected devices, by voice technology, and automated subscriptions, which is making retail to be anywhere and no longer confined to a traditional stores. Agility and speed are becoming even more critical as we have high mobile penetration and faster wireless network speeds. These trends are sort of creating more demand in shopper base that expect to get what they want, how they want it, and when they want it. And we've seen increasingly, this has been mentioned, but just to wrap it up, experience and personalization really rule, and you can't avoid those two to win with in the current dynamic. We're seeing more shoppers are shifting towards purchasing experiences rather than things, and that's driving the need for brands and retailers to create new brand experiences. And all of that is having an effect on the supply chain, which is becoming increasingly automated and fragmented. New ways for sort of consumers to buy and receive products. They continue to sort of complicate logistics, encouraging retailers to deploy new technologies, including artificial intelligence, drones, and autonomous vehicles. With that, we would go. I just wanted to mention quickly with that, We do provide leading FMCG and retail businesses with the expertise, network, and information to confidently make strategic decisions, future investment, and navigate disruption in key retail market around the world. We do have all of these recommendations, which with very thorough analysis, retailers and suppliers would need in order to win in the US. If you're interested in obtaining these recommendations and strategic insight from our global analyst team, please contact us directly. We will share our contact information at the conclusion of the presentation. With that, I'll turn it over to Boris, who can look through if there are any questions that come through.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks very much, Usman. So these last comments take us to the end of this presentation. We're now opening up the floor to questions from the audience. You got the chat functions where you can be in touch, and we'll try and answer right now, or depending on the number of questions that are coming in, we'll be in touch later. So please remember you can use the chat functions. Now, looking in the questions box, Osman, here's one right for you. So you hear a lot about big box coming under pressure, but it's not really disappearing, or is it? It's still going to remain a important channel in the market?
Yeah, so I don't see big bucks sort of disappearing within the US. However, the overall number is slowing down. So the number of stores open is slowing down. If you look at Walmart and some of like Kroger and Target, they're really reducing the number of big bucks that they're opening. While these stores are not going to go away, I think their role are going to be changed. So we're seeing sort of the blend. We're moving into a future where there's going to be blurring between online and offline, and that's where the role of these big box stores are coming into place. They're serving as fulfillment centers with initiative like buy online, pick up in store, but they're also becoming an experiential destination where you get to learn and test products. So we're seeing food service being added into some of these stores, and educational components being added, and hosting events. So I think it would just evolve and to meet sort of the current demands of experiential shoppers that we have. Overall, the number of stores would reduce, but I don't think they're going to go away.
Okay, thanks very much. And another question here is, what are, in your view, the most interesting examples for online to offline integration in the US market?
I think one of the people that's doing it pretty well right now is Walmart, just in terms of what they've done with grocery delivery and sort of their recent news with partnering with Postmate. And if you look at the number of pickup points that they've had, I think they've made tremendous progress in that point. Amazon is another one that's doing a phenomenal job with the acquisition of Whole Foods, where you can see some of the products that you have, you can buy online and then pick up in Whole Foods, but you can do vice versa as well, where you can discover a product at the Whole Foods and then buy in store. So we're going to see retailers sort of leverage that physical aspect store in different ways. Fulfillment, I think for now, is sort of the most prominent way that that's been done. But we also seen Amazon have their treasure truck that's going to be stationed at a few of the Whole Foods stores. So there's really different ways that they're doing it. And on the back end too, there's a lot of stuff going on around inventory management and also just improving processes.
All right, thanks very much. And here's another question that probably I'll pick up. Do you think these trends from the US are reflecting wider global trends, certainly in developed retail markets? Yeah, I think that's true. So one common feature between the US and the Western European Union and Japan is, and actually China, is that societies are aging really fast, and that brings with it a chain of events such as birth rates are going down, households are getting smaller, there's less need for big weekly shopping trips, there's more demand for convenience, and also as a result of income redistribution, taxpayers are under pressure. So I think since the mid-2000s, probably Europe has seen its historic peak in wealth, and now pensions are under pressure. incomes are under pressure, real incomes of people who work, unemployment benefits are under pressure, and this erosion of wealth in the US, in Europe, in Japan, in aging markets in general leads to a shift in priorities and mindsets with consumers. So I think we see people be less materialistic because material success is simply more difficult to achieve. What else was I going to say? And this is partly a driver, I believe, behind the rise of experience that is becoming more important in the eyes of many consumers, and that in turn then sort of is reflected in a retail landscape that looks after a lower income end of the market and a more experiential end of the market, and retailers capturing parts of the experiential slice. So digital transformation in full swing in the US, in Europe, in Japan, in China. And China is not a developed market. It's still, incomes are still much poorer than in Europe, but it's the biggest emerging market that has this aging dynamic and this digital transformation dynamic. So actually, and thanks for that question, because that's a really interesting one. So things you see in the US can teach you how to deal with similar problems in Europe. And by doing business in China, you can probably learn about technologies and solutions that will become relevant in the US soon. So it's always worth having this global view on the market. And here's another question, probably one for you, Usman. It says, I would like to ask if the loyalty programs will still be effective in the retail market.
I think yes, to some extent they would still be, but I think we have to change what the way we reward loyalty. I think in the past it's been primarily sort of on a price basis. I think that has to change, where you really have to look at loyalty in a much broader sense, where we have in some companies who are like rewarding healthy behaviors, for instance. So I think we have to link sort of social sort of drivers and social life to what's happening in store. And I think Starbucks is a good example of a new type of loyalty program that they have with their mobile that rewards you for different things. So I think it's just reimagining what the loyalty is and making sure it's not just you might take an action that they can then reward you in store. It's just broadening the definition of what a loyalty is and not restricting it to what it used to be.
Yeah, and I think there's interesting material on that on our portals as well, which our client services will be happy to guide you to. Now, another question here. It was mentioned that CPG must build and own customer relationship. What role do you think 3P marketplaces will play in supporting this relationship? And do you see 3P and CPG partnerships or alliances coming out of it, or will it remain highly segmented? So just to recap, the big question here is, what role do you think 3P marketplaces will play in supporting the relationship between a brand and a customer?
That's a really good question in terms of, and we have sort of a big report on sort of 3P marketplaces that address a lot of those specifically. While it is a difficult relationship between 3P marketplaces and CPG suppliers, there's a lot of partnership that could be beneficial to both parties. And actually, more of this is happening at a much higher pace in places like China compared to the US, where we're seeing some of these brands. 3P marketplaces, one of their advantages, they aggregate sort of massive amount of shopper, and they have a huge amount of data that could be used in partnership with 3P to design certain products, or to look at what are some of the most valuable, what are the highest moving SKUs, and really understanding the shopper behavior. So I think partnership around data management and getting insight into the shopper can be really valuable. That can feed back into 3PG suppliers' decision making. but also just partnering with them on fulfillment as well. Some of these 3P marketplaces are some of the most innovative companies who are really pushing and trying different innovations. They're really at the forefront of, if you look at drone technology, if you look at sort of automation in the warehouse. So I think there's a lot of opportunities for the two to partner and work hand in hand.
Yeah, thanks very much, Usman. And that actually seems to have been the last question coming in today. So if you would like to know more about our research, or if you have any further questions that you think about later, or very simply, if you'd like to see where you can find our report that we've basically been basing this webinar on, please just get in touch with us. So you can either write to Usman or myself directly. You can see the email addresses here, or you can write to our help point at info@planetretail.net. And with this, we'd like to thank you for your attention. Thank you for your time, and hope to see you again soon. Have a good day. Thanks very much.